A high school girl was writing a paper for one of her classes, and she came to her dad and she said, Dad, what is the difference between annoyance and anger and exasperation? Her father said, well, it's just a matter of degree, really, but let me show you what I mean. So he picked up his phone and he just punched in a number at random. And the fellow answered on the other end, and the father said, hello, is Melvin there? And the guy said, there's no one living here by the name Melvin. He said, you've got the wrong number. Hung up, and the father said, now, see, that man wasn't happy with our call. He was probably busy, and we interrupted something, and he was annoyed by a wrong number call. He said, now watch this. So he hit redial and rang the number again and said, hello, is Melvin there? And the guy on the other end said, now look here, you just called and I told you there's no one here by the name of Melvin, and you got some kind of nerve calling me again. Hung up. The father said, now you see, that was anger. He said, now let me show you what exasperation is. So he hit redial again, and the voice rather violently said, hello? And the father said, hello, this is Melvin. Have there been any calls for me? Well, we all face challenges of annoyance and exasperation and even anger. And in the past 5 lessons, we, in talking about home improvement, have talked about a need for home improvement. Just like in our physical houses, they need work and repair and maintenance, so they do in our relationships as husbands and wives and as parents and children. And we've discussed the need for the right kind of values and what the family is all about. We've talked about secrets for a successful and satisfying marriage. In 2 of those, the communication of thoughts and compromise during conflict, those 2 are oftentimes undermined by the problem of anger. In fact, really in all of our previous 5 lessons, much of what we write can be undermined by the problem of anger. And so tonight we want to talk about anger management in the home. It's good to see each one with us tonight, and I trust we have a goodly number that's watching online. And I hope these lessons will be helpful to you. Regardless of where you are in your relationship, regardless of your age, whether you're married or single or been married a long time, doesn't really make any difference. All of us, I think, can probably use this lesson to help us in our relationships and especially in our home relationship. And the fact of the matter is, we're going to talk about this in more detail tomorrow night about conflict, but there's always going to be conflict. And whether or not the conflict escalates into anger or not is up to us. That we can learn how to disagree without being disagreeable. And we can even learn how to argue without assassinating the character of others. And we can learn how to differ without creating discord. The wise man said in Proverbs 11 in verse 29, that he who troubles his own house will inherit the wind. Now, what the wise man was saying is simply this: the man who brings trouble on his family is not going to have anything at the end, that you are going to have some problems. And so let's begin and think about some ways that will help us in properly managing the issue of anger. And I want to begin with the first one that ought to be obvious to us, but it may not be obvious to us. And that's the fact that we must admit our anger. Stop denying that you have anger. Now, I know right away that we have a large enough crowd here tonight, and even watching at home, I'm sure, that might be saying, I don't get angry. I'm not an angry person. Now, we're going to see there's different ways in a few minutes that we may express anger or get anger. But one of the challenges oftentimes is people being honest and admitting the problem of anger. And I think one reason that we don't want to admit that we're angry is because we feel like that anger is a sin. In the book of Ephesians, in chapter 4 and verse 25, the apostle said, "Therefore put away lying. Let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil." We need to understand the issue that anger in and of itself is not a sin. The Bible says over 300 times that God in the Old Testament, that Jehovah God gets angry. In fact, the psalmist said that God is angry with the wicked every day. And so anger in and of itself is not sin. Jesus got angry. I think you'd be hard-pressed to deny that when Jesus went into the temple and he saw the money changers there, and he said, You made my father's house a den of thieves, a house of merchandise. And Jesus went in and he overthrew the tables of the money changers, and he even took whips and he drove the people out. Jesus was angry. And the Bible speaks of it as a righteous indignation. And so anger is not a sin, but lying about it is. He says here in Ephesians 4, lying about it is a sin. And so we need to be careful that we're not denying our anger. It's kind of like a couple gets into a little bit and you say, "You're angry." And she says, "No, I'm not." You go, "Yes, you are." She says, "I'm not angry." "Now, I can tell you're angry." "I'm not angry. Now drop it." Now, I don't know if that's ever happened in your home or not, or you've seen anybody that's happened with, but there's a classic case of denial. Anger may signal the fact that you care. Anger may be an expression of love. It may say, "I love you too much to act this way. I love you too much to waste your life. I love you too much to be making a mistake like this." Let's not lie about our anger. Let's be honest when we're angry. Now, let me tell you something else about anger that you may not have thought about. But anger is the number one cause of depression. If you read books about depression, depression is often defined as frozen rage or anger turned inward. Several years ago, when I was living in Louisville, one of the elders came to me and he asked me if I would do a lesson on depression. And he went on to explain to me that he had called several people from the previous Sunday that were absent. And he was amazed at the number of people that said they were depressed and didn't feel like coming to church. Well, when he told me that, Ralph, I'd never preached depression in my life. In fact, I wasn't even sure it was a topic at the time. When your elders ask you to do something, you agree usually. So I said, okay. So I went back to my office and I started thinking about depression and anger and all of this. And I went down to the bookstore down at Religious Supply Center in Louisville, and I got a book on depression that was written by a Christian counselor. And that's the first thing he told me about depression, that depression is anger turned inward. And a lot of times, people that don't act like they're angry people, they don't appear to be angry, are angry, and they suppress their anger. And in suppressing their anger, they cause all kinds of depression. Well, I started interviewing some counselors in the area of Louisville, and I learned that anger is one of the top 3 causes of depression. Well, these studies put me back in the Bible where I should have been in the first place. And I began to realize there's a good deal in the Bible about the idea of depression. I mean, you look at Moses at times that he was so depressed that one time he said, "Lord, take my life." And Moses got angry with the children of Israel and the way that they acted through the wilderness wanderings. Elijah got depressed. You remember that time he said, "Lord, I'm all alone." And there he was sitting under that tree and ready to die. Lord, just take my life. I don't want to live anymore. I met a lady when I was doing this study that is one of the few people that have lived to tell about jumping off of the Kennedy Bridge into the Ohio River. And she was a lady that to meet her, you wouldn't think this, and she admitted that through her life, that she always wanted to come across the people as polite and nice and kind and easy to get along with, and didn't raise her voice, didn't have any visible display of anger. But obviously, when she jumped off that bridge and into the Ohio River thinking she's going to kill herself, and she didn't, that she went into counseling, and the counselor said that you're depressed. Well, okay. And he said, you're depressed because you're angry about something that you're holding inside. She said, well, I'm not angry. I'm not an angry person. Yes, you are. Well, as the story unfolded, she was, and she had some relationship issues, guess what, in her home, that she had suppressed, and she suppressed all of that anger and become so depressed that she wanted to take her own life. So what I'm saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, that anger is a very serious thing, and there's no use denying when we have anger. We need to admit when we have anger. And if we're not careful, we can allow that anger to turn internally to such an extent that it can cause depression, and we can end up with a lot worse problems. So that's the first thing, admit our anger. The second thing is, I need to learn to understand my anger. The wise man said in Proverbs 14, verse 29, those who control their anger have great understanding, and those with a hasty temper will make mistakes. And so we need to learn about our anger and to think about why we're angry and have some insight into ourselves in seeing that. So let me just ask you, how do you express your anger? I'm not sure where I came across this. I don't think I thought of this, but I didn't give credit here when I did these notes some time ago. But at any rate, someone said, are you like a skunk? In other words, when you get angry, do you stink up the place? The wise man said in Proverbs 15 and verse 18, a wrathful man stirs up strife. Now, you know people like that. They're angry like a skunk. I mean, they just stink up the place, and they get upset and they stir up strife. And boy, you know for sure they're angry. Or maybe some people are angry like a turtle. They withdraw. Now, when you withdraw, then that's where bitterness comes in. And Ephesians 4:31 connects anger with bitterness. And so when we get angry and we withdraw with that anger, it becomes deep-seated, and that's going to turn into bitterness. Or do you get angry like a pit bull? You know, a pit bull can explode in a violent rage. And there's some people that are fierce and they explode with rage. And in fact, also in the same passage in Ephesians 4:31, the apostle there connects anger with wrath and clamor. And that's a more violent form. But people that get angry often are very wrathful people and clamorous people. Or do you get angry like a cobra? See, a cobra is waiting for a quick and a deadly strike. And, you know, it's like a fellow said one time to me. He said, I don't get angry, I get even. So he's the cobra guy. So he's not going to lash out, he's not going to blow up, but he's going to wait and pick and choose his time, his moment, and then he's going to strike because of his anger. Well, these are things that we need to get inside ourselves and to think about how we express our anger. Also, in understanding our anger is to understand how it comes about. So here are the 4 phases of an argument that leads to anger. First of all is a recognition that we are on the road to this. And you all know the signs. You have some sharp words, and there's some things that are said back and forth. And you realize that if I don't stop here, then it's going to get bad. But most people don't. They get started into an argument and they don't really recognize it and they keep going. And so then there's a reaction. And this is where you really get into it. And people react in a negative way and in an angry way. Now, too oftentimes that's where we stop. That there's a recognition of where this is going, but we don't care and we plunge forward. And then we get angry. And what always happens when you're angry? You say things you regret. You do things you wish you hadn't done. Now, at that point, some people stomp off and they go cool off and then they pretend like it never happened. That really doesn't solve anything. So the next step needs to be resolution. That you resolve the situation. Now, sometimes you do need to cool off a little bit, but the situation needs to be resolved, and then there needs to be reconciliation, both with each other and with the Lord. And so as the psalmist put it in Psalm 119, verse 59, he said, I thought about my ways, and I turned my feet to your testimonies. And so we need to stop and think about our ways. We need to stop and think about the way that we deal with anger, and we need to turn to God's Word. 2 Corinthians 13 verse 5 says, examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. All of this is a part of understanding our anger. So, look at this. When we get angry, we feel unaccepted. Rejection causes anger. And when we feel unaccepted, sometimes that comes about, just give you an example of comparison. And so never compare your children one to another. That's going to cause a problem, and that's probably going to cause anger. Or ladies, don't compare your husband to somebody else's husband. Or guys, don't compare your wife to somebody else's wife. We're going to feel unaccepted. We get angry when we feel unappreciated, when people take us for granted. You know, many women feel unappreciated because they feel that they are rated at the very bottom of their husband's attention. And this causes anger. Now, they may not lash out. They may be like the lady I described a while ago, that she just held it in for many years. But they feel unappreciated because of their anger. When I get angry, I feel unsupported. I feel unsupported emotionally, physically, and maybe even spiritually as well. When we get angry, we feel unprotected. We feel vulnerable. We feel like that life is out of control. And when we get angry, we feel uncertain. If we don't feel like we can trust each other or the people that we're in a relationship, they're going to be honest with us. Now, there's a lot more we could probably say about all of this, but I hope this is enough to try to give you some insight into the idea of, number one, admitting your anger, and number two, understanding your anger. And this takes again an honesty. It takes an honesty to get inside yourself. You know, the Bible any number of times said, be not deceived. But I think when it comes to this issue of anger, that how often do we deceive ourselves? And we try to deceive other people, but it won't work. Well, the third thing is that we need to deal immediately with anger. Don't procrastinate when you're dealing with anger. Let's go back to this passage in Ephesians 4. He says, do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. I like the translation that says, not to give the devil a foothold. Because when we are angry with each other, and in our anger we sin, then we've given the devil a foothold. And when we don't do anything about it, when we stomp off in anger, and even though we may cool off, and then we go on our way and we act like nothing ever happened, or we may be angry for a few days. And it's kind of, you know how that tension is, you know, in a house when you're angry. either your husband or wife or your children or parents, and you don't say much. And so you go along a day, 2 days, 3 days, however many days. And then everybody kind of lets it go and you begin to get back to normal. And nothing's been solved. You've let the sun go down on your wrath. And so the idea is work it out. Don't procrastinate. Don't put it off. Because unresolved anger and conflict keeps growing. We mentioned a minute ago from Colossians that he talks there about bitterness. In fact, one of the things he says in Colossians 3 to husbands is not to be bitter against your wives. I wonder why he puts that on men. Well, maybe it's because it's easy for us, if we're not careful, to allow our unresolved conflicts to grow to the point that it becomes bitterness. And then bitterness is going to turn into hatred, and hatred is going to turn into hostility. Unresolved conflict is going to continue to grow. There's no way around it. Sometimes the only thing that we can do, to coin the expression from Albert Cliff, is to let go and let God. Let go and let God. Now, it takes two people to fuss. And sometimes in dealing with a problem, you just got to put it in a too hard box, as one lady said. Give it over to the Lord and let go. Because it is what it is. And being angry, being bitter, being contentious, fuming and fussing is not going to solve the problem. But however I deal with it, I need to learn to deal with it immediately. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Now, I want to spend the rest of our time this evening on the fourth point, because our topic is anger management. And so far, we've pretty much talked about the problem, okay? So let's talk specifically here about learning to control our anger. In Proverbs 19 and verse 11, he said, a man's discretion makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook a transgression. And so a person with prudence, with wisdom, with discretion, with insight, learns to control their anger. They're slow to anger, and he says there's time to overlook a transgression. You know, parents, you don't have to call your kids on every single thing. I mean, every single thing that they do that you don't agree with, you don't have to make it an issue. You know, we talked last night about parenting, about rules. And that's part of the problem with having too many rules. That when you have so many rules, then you don't want to overlook anything. I mean, every teeny tiny thing becomes an issue. And there's some things you learn to overlook. Now, I didn't make that up. That's what the wise man said. All right? And so I think that's pretty good counsel. That's pretty good wisdom. Now, I want to give you 4 specific ways that can help you in controlling your anger. Regardless whether you're the person that lashes out and you're like the pit bull with it, or you're like the turtle with the jaws or whatever, you need to learn to control it. And the first way is realizing the cost of anger. Again, Proverbs 29 and verse 22 says, a hot-tempered person starts fights and they get into all kinds of trouble or all kinds of sin. Well, you need to realize the cost. We mentioned a moment ago in Ephesians 4, down about verse 31, the Apostle Paul there connects anger with other sins, doesn't he? Anger and wrath and clamor and bitterness and all kinds of other things. Unwholesome words. That word unwholesome means putrid language. What almost always happens when our anger gets out of control? Then we talk ugly. We say things we shouldn't say. We engage in language that is unbecoming to a Christian. Or we may do something. And it may not even be toward another person. Sometimes people do things that are self-destructive because of their anger, and it gets them into all kinds of trouble. I have a friend, and this happened to him many years ago, and so I'm assuming that he's gotten better with his anger. But a gospel preacher, when he was a young man, he dealt with some anger issues. He was going off with his family, of all things, to a gospel meeting. And they were hurrying to get out and to get into the car and get everything loaded. And they get out and they get into the car, and lo and behold, he didn't have his car keys. And he goes back to the house to get his keys, and they had turned the lock on the inside and the door was locked. So now he not only doesn't have his car keys, they're in the house and he's locked out of the house. And in his frustration and anger, he took his fist and put his fist through the window of the door. It was one of those kind that he could open up the lock. Well, he was able to open up the lock all right, but guess what? That he cut, and you medical people probably know what artery goes through right in here in your wrist, but he about bled out to death. Took him to the hospital, and this has been probably 30 years ago or better, and ended up with $20,000 in hospital bills. All because of what? Uncontrolled anger. So there was a cost. There was a cost, wasn't it? But there's another cost. Have you ever had a situation, or maybe you haven't, but you know someone that's had a situation where someone in a relationship has blown up in anger against a friend or a neighbor or a brother in Christ, maybe a family member, and that relationship has never been the same since? I'm just reading today about a woman that talked about a problem. She was estranged from a cousin. And because of some things that would happen years before, they never were able to patch that up. There's a cost, not just necessarily monetarily, but certainly in our relationships, and most of all spiritually. And so as we think about controlling our anger, always stop and realize and to think about the cost of uncontrolled anger. The second thing that will help us is to learn to reflect before reacting. In James chapter 1 and verse 19, James says, "So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath." Now, what's that saying? Well, that's saying reflect before reacting. Listen. Don't be so quick to pop off and say something that you're going to regret. And don't be so quick to get angry. Now, we've already said anger in itself is not a sin. And there may be a time about something that causes you in a righteous way to express anger and in a right way to do it. But even then, be slow. Be slow to that and think things through. I'm going to give you another word here because, see, what happens when we get into it, we react. See, someone says that and we react. Let me give you a word that's better, and that's respond. Learn to respond. Because when we respond, then we learn to control our actions, our attitudes, and our words. Now, I'm going to give you an example of a true story that happened a number of years ago out west. And this is back in the days when the sheep herders that came in didn't get along with the cattle ranchers. And this fella had bought a ranch and he put sheep on it. Well, the cattle rancher next to him didn't like his sheep. And the rancher had dogs that were pretty mean. And the dogs would come over into the sheep herder's field and would kill his sheep. Well, he knew that the rancher didn't like him and he didn't like the sheep. And he thought about, well, I could sue him, but that's going to drag out, and that's only going to make him madder, and it may take a long time to resolve it. Or he thought I could go over there and just give him a piece of my mind. But what's that going to solve? You know, me doing that. So the sheep herder come up with an ingenious idea. One day he takes his truck and puts 4 baby lambs into the truck, drives over to the rancher's house, and said that he wanted to give each one of his children a little lamb. Well, what could the rancher say? Except thank you. And the kids, of course, adored the lambs. Well, when that happened, guess what he did with the dogs? He put the dogs up and kept them where they wouldn't kill his children's little lambs, and it solved the sheep herder's problem. Now, that's pretty ingenious, isn't it? But it's just an illustration sometimes of thinking about how we can respond to the situation instead of reacting to the situation and making things worse. If we come back to James's admonition, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to get angry, we'll be a lot better off. Well, the third thing I would suggest is to release anger appropriately. And we've already alluded to this, but let me read the passage in Ephesians 4:29. He says, do not use foul or abusive language. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those that hear them. And so again, we're talking about how to appropriately release our anger in a situation. So here, well, before I get this, I got a couple things I don't think I have in the notes that I want to mention to you. I was thinking about these this afternoon, and sometimes when I'm doing this in a Bible class situation, I like to talk about this. So I want to give you these two things. You know, there's a that people deal with their anger. Some people blow up and others clam up. See? And so here we have the idea of blowing up. Now, have you ever heard someone say, well, yeah, I blow up, but I get over it real quick. I get over it. Well, my answer to that is, yeah, you do. But you know, a tornado can come through here and cause all kinds of damage in its wake, and it's gone pretty quick. But look at the damage that tornado has caused. And so just because you get over your anger real quick, that doesn't make it right to cause all kinds of damage through foul or abusive language. Other people clam up. And other people we talked about a while ago that hold it in. And that's going to cause a problem. And so learn to deal appropriately with your anger. When I say that, I always think of the stereotype example. Some men clam up too. But I think of the stereotype example that I heard a fellow give of the husband and wife, and he did something that morning before he left for work that upset her. And she stewed about it all day. He didn't know he'd upset her. He comes home in the evening, puts down his briefcase. She's in the kitchen fixing supper. You remember I said this was a stereotype illustration. A couple of you got that. Okay. She's in the kitchen fixing supper. He comes up behind her and gives her a little hug. And I don't know if any of you ever experienced this or not, if your wife's upset and you go to get her, and she gives you one of those, she stiffens. Oh, I see some of the women smiling. They've actually done that. Okay. And she stiffens up a little bit. Now, having the gift of perception, he goes, honey, is everything okay? She goes, yes. He goes and sits down, maybe turns on the TV, maybe picks up a magazine, maybe checks his messages. And she's in there, not saying a word. Maybe he says something to her, not saying anything. And he gets to thinking, she seems awful quiet. He said, dear, you're awful quiet. Is everything okay? And she goes, why wouldn't it be? Well, that's not a real good way to handle anger. See? I mean, you clam up, but eventually something is going to come out instead of just dealing with it. All right. Now, let me give you here some suggestions on releasing the anger appropriately. One is to be brief. Sometimes we belabor the point, we make it worse. So Proverbs 17:27 said, a man of knowledge uses words with restraint, and a man of understanding is even tempered. Now, don't be like one comedian quipped. He said, my wife is even-tempered. She's mad all the time. Well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about controlling our anger, controlling our temper. So be brief in dealing with the issue. The other thing is to learn to be specific. And so, ladies, when you're dealing with a problem with your husband, you don't have to say, you're a slob. That's probably not going to go very far. But you might say, would you mind picking up your dirty socks from the living room floor and put them in a clothes hamper? That's specific. So we can understand. Any of us guys can understand what that means. See, to be specific. I was thinking from a biblical standpoint, God just doesn't call us a bunch of wretched sinners. God is specific on what wrongdoing is. So you have lists like in Galatians 5 of the works of the flesh, or in Romans 13, or in other places, that God is specific about what displeases Him and what is right and wrong. In fact, if you go back to the old law is really specific, isn't it? Full of statutes and ordinances. The Jews weren't left with any doubt about what God wanted and what pleased Him and what didn't please Him. So maybe it's a pretty good model to follow. Be brief, be specific, and then be humble. Be humble. The wise man said, by pride comes nothing but strife. And so you don't have to be haughty about it, arrogant about it. I'm better than you, but be humble when you're dealing with it. So let me just bullet here the 7 ground rules for a fair fight. All right. Never compare. In other words, why can't you be like? Never condemn. And condemning starts with words like this. You always, you never, you must. Watch out for absolutes that begin with the word you. Okay. Especially when they're said with the wrong kind of tone. That's another one right there. It's not always what we say, it's the tone with which we say it. My wife reminds me of that once in a while about my tone. I say something and my tone's not very nice. And so we need to watch that. So never compare, never condemn, never command. You better do. Don't do that. Never challenge, don't make threats. I tell you what, you keep that up and you'll see what happens. It's kind of like mother talking about, she told her kids, she was tired of them fussing and fighting. She said, I don't want to hear a peep out of you kids. Now, you know what smart aleck kids will do? Peep. You may have had it happen. So you gotta watch that. Never condescend. Don't belittle. Don't ridicule. Don't talk down to. Never contradict. In other words, interrupt in the middle of a sentence. And then never confuse. It's like when we're losing an argument and we see we're losing the argument and then we change the subject and bring up some unrelated issue. Don't do that. That's not fighting fair. And then the fourth and the final way that will help us control anger is to rely on, there it is. Rely on Christ's help. I'm reminded of the passage of Philippians 2 and verse 5, where Paul said, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. What if we applied that principle to this issue of anger? That we had the same attitude, or some versions say the same mind of Christ? Wouldn't that go a long way towards solving some of these anger issues and problems we have? And then to realize that if we're struggling with anger, we're struggling with a temper, that like Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That you can overcome. Some people just justify it. I remember a fellow place I preached, and he was he had exploded in a business meeting or say ugly things to other people. And then he would justify it, and he would say, well, that's just the way I am. That's just the way I am. Well, the way he was wrong. And so what we need to do is not justify the way we are if we got an anger problem, is to realize through Christ's help, we can find the strength to overcome. And then Paul said in Philippians 4 and verse 19, that my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus. Now you think about that. What will God supply? He said all of your need. Now, don't we typically talk about how God will take care of what we need? Well, what do you need? Well, not just spiritual blessings, but God will take care of you physically and materially, emotionally. He'll take care of relationally. All of your needs. God will supply all of your needs. And so there we are. Anger management in the home. Admit your anger. Understand your anger. Deal immediately with your anger, and then learn what you need to do to control your anger. In Romans 12 and verse 2, the Apostle Paul said, don't let the world squeeze you into its own mold. Or as we commonly read in most English versions, don't be conformed to the world. We live in a world with a lot of anger. There's a lot of rage. I mean, we hear about road rage and all kinds of rage today. You know, there's another kind of rage I just want to mention here in closing a little bit. We hear of road rage. How about word rage? And it's not always spoken person to person. I'm on Facebook, and I put my blog on there and use it for that purpose mainly, and put some pictures of the grandkids and some of our travels and so forth. But have you ever noticed on Facebook how people can get into it and get into an ugly fuss on Facebook and start calling names and saying ugly things with one another? Word rage, anger. Before we hit reply, maybe we better stop and think about what we're saying and think about how it is that we're saying it. In closing, think of your life a little bit like this. Think of your life as a tube of toothpaste. And whatever is squeezed is going to come out. If you're filled with anger and resentment and bitterness and strife, then when the squeeze is put on, you're going to get angry. That's what's going to come out. But suppose what you put on the inside is the fruit of the Spirit. Love and joy and peace and patience and goodness and long-suffering, those kinds of virtues and qualities. Suppose that's what you're putting inside. And so when the squeeze is put on, then the fruit of the Spirit is what's going to come out. Finally, in your anger, do not sin. I hope this has been a helpful lesson, and I hope it's been a practical lesson, and I hope it's one that you will find will bring improvement in your relationships and in your home life. We're going to close the service tonight with 326, Trust and Obey. We sing that song often as an invitation song for those that are not Christians. And certainly the Lord's invitation is open 24/7, whether we're in an assembly like this or not, for anyone that hasn't obeyed the gospel through faith, repentance, and baptism to be a Christian, to trust and obey. But this invitation and this call of trust and obey is to all of us, whether we're Christians or not. And for us as Christians to really trust the Lord, can we trust the Lord with the challenges we face and the feelings that well up within us and the problems we're trying to deal with, the relational issues that we may have in the home, and that His book has answers, even when it comes to such a practical issue as anger? I believe that we can, and I trust that we will. And so tonight, if we can help you in some public way to better trust and obey, we invite you to come as we stand and sing.
When